There came a point in nearly every front of World War II when medicine simply ran out. In the mountains of Italy, the jungles of Burma, and the frozen villages of the Eastern Front, soldiers, civilians and medics faced wounds and sickness with nothing but what they could scavenge. Bandages were reused, morphine was gone, and infection was spreading faster than orders could be delivered. And when that happened, when even alcohol and iodine were gone, people turned to what humanity had relied on for thousands of years before antibiotics existed: salt and fat. For many, it was desperation. For others, it was tradition reawakened. Soldiers recalled lessons from grandmothers, farmers and hunters who knew how to keep wounds clean and bodies nourished, using nothing but the two most basic resources of survival. Today, we'll uncover how salt and fat became the only medicine left, and how these crude methods actually worked, saving countless lives in the darkest hours of war. When medicine disappeared, the old ways came back to life. In 1943, the German Sixth Army, trapped at Stalingrad, had no medical supplies left. Wounded soldiers lay in snow-covered bunkers with festering wounds, frostbite and starvation setting in. Soviet partisans, hiding in forests, faced the same problem: no hospitals, no antiseptics, and no hope of supply drops. Across Europe and Asia, the collapse of supply chains forced a return to folk medicine. Salt and fat were the most accessible materials in any field kitchen or butcher's shed. Salt was stored for food preservation, while animal fat came from rations, hunting, or even battlefield scavenging. What made these two so valuable wasn't just their availability, but their properties. Salt is one of the oldest natural antiseptics known to humankind. It dehydrates bacteria, drawing moisture out of wounds and halting infection. Fat, on the other hand, was the perfect barrier and binder. It protected wounds from further contamination, sealed in warmth, and could be used as a carrier for herbs, ash, or even crushed charcoal when medics tried to improvise poultices. These weren't ideal solutions, but when antibiotics didn't exist or couldn't be reached, they were the only line of defense left. How salt was used to fight infection and clean wounds in wartime. Salt treatment was brutal but effective. Soldiers and medics alike knew that salt would sting like fire, but it saved limbs and sometimes lives. A common field method involved dissolving salt in boiled water to make a concentrated saline solution. The wound was then rinsed repeatedly to flush out debris and pus. In more severe cases, salt crystals were applied directly, covered with cloth, and left to draw out infection overnight. Accounts from Soviet field nurses and resistance fighters describe using salt compresses to treat deep cuts and gunshot wounds when nothing else was available. The salt would crust over the surface, drawing fluid outward while limiting bacterial growth beneath. Though painful, this method often prevented gangrene long enough for the patient to survive evacuation or regaining some strength. Even in the Pacific, where humidity bred infection rapidly, Allied soldiers used salt water as a crude antiseptic rinse for tropical ulcers and leech bites. Naval medics relied on seawater when fresh supplies ran low, often instructing wounded men to soak injuries in the ocean to cleanse and disinfect them. For modern survivalists, this principle still applies. A simple saline rinse, made with clean boiled water and a few spoonfuls of salt, remains one of the safest natural disinfectants you can prepare in the wild. It's not pleasant, but neither was wartime medicine. If salt cleaned, fat protected. Once a wound was dried, salted or rinsed, fat served as the next layer, a primitive ointment. Rendered animal fat or tallow was melted down, strained, and then allowed to cool into a salve-like texture. When applied to skin, it sealed the wound, keeping dirt, moisture, and bacteria out. It also prevented cracking and frostbite, especially on hands and feet exposed to cold. In remote mountain regions, German and Finnish troops mixed fat with charcoal or ash to create an absorbent paste that could be spread over wounds or frostbitten skin. The charcoal drew out infection, while the fat locked in warmth and moisture. Farmers and peasants living in occupied zones used pig fat mixed with salt as an anti-inflammatory balm, treating burns, blisters and sores caused by rationing and exposure. In modern terms, fat acted as both a moisturizer and a crude antibiotic barrier, similar to how petroleum jelly works today. It wasn't sterile, but it slowed deterioration and kept wounds flexible enough to heal naturally. The same principle applied to frostbite. Rubbing fat into the skin after slow rewarming reduced tissue cracking and restored circulation. For anyone interested in traditional survival techniques, rendering fat today is simple. Slowly melt animal fat over low heat until it turns liquid, strain it through a cloth, and store it in a sealed container. When cooled, it solidifies into a durable salve. Combined with salt, you've recreated the wartime field dressing kit that countless soldiers relied upon when all else failed. Salt and fat weren't just for wounds, they kept bodies alive from the inside out. Beyond external healing, these two staples also played a deeper role. Starvation and dehydration weakened immune systems, so medics and civilians used salt and fat internally when food was scarce. Fat provided dense calories and energy. One spoonful could keep a soldier marching through snow for hours. Salt restored lost electrolytes from sweating, blood loss or diarrhea, preventing fatigue and confusion. In makeshift field hospitals, broths made from animal bones, fat and salt were given to the sick as the only form of medicine left. They replenished minerals, restored warmth and aided recovery even in dire malnutrition. It's no exaggeration to say that salt and fat kept many alive through both infection and famine. Today we see echoes of this in modern survival diets. Salt prevents hyponatremia and fat fuels endurance when carbohydrates are gone. The same balance that sustained soldiers and civilians under siege still sustains explorers, hikers and preppers who understand how to use natural resources wisely. What's striking about this chapter of wartime medicine isn't just its simplicity, it's the adaptability it represents. When every modern convenience was stripped away, people remembered what their ancestors already knew. Healing doesn't always come from a factory. Sometimes it comes from knowledge, courage, and the ability to use what's around you. Salt and fat became symbols of survival, proof that humanity's oldest remedies can still stand when technology collapses. In a time when supplies vanish or logistics fail, understanding these principles could once again make the difference between infection and recovery, between life and death. The story of how salt and fat became the only medicine left during the war is a reminder of how easily modern comfort blinds us to ancient wisdom. These were not miracle cures, they were desperate measures born out of necessity, but they worked. They saved soldiers, partisans and civilians who had nothing else. If you value real survival knowledge, the kind that's proven by history rather than theory, then this is one lesson worth keeping alive. Try making your own fat-based salve, Practice preparing saline safely and understand how these materials interact. Because someday, what was once a wartime improvisation might again become your best defense. If you enjoyed uncovering this lost chapter of survival history, make sure to subscribe to Echoes of Valor for more forgotten wartime techniques that still hold practical value today. Share this with a fellow history enthusiast, because the wisdom that kept our ancestors alive deserves to be remembered, not forgotten.